And into this situation in 1952 was injected a very important event which was to go on to lay the seeds for the Cuban Revolution. And that was the situation where in 1953, with 120 people, Castro, his brother Raul, and a few others made an attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago, a quite heroic attack. At the time, it may have appeared to many to be a quite futile attack, but this attack on the barracks was really an expression of the anger of that layer of the intelligentsia, particularly at the coming to power of the dictator Batista. Now, the event itself was relatively small in its immediate significance. They were arrested, they were later exiled to Mexico, and so on. But this was really the origin of what became the July 26 movement, because that raid on the barracks took place on July the 26th, 1953. Batista called it a communist putsch, and the Communist Party referred to it as a bourgeois putsch. But in 1955, Che Guevara, his brother Raul, who was around the young communists in Cuba, and Che Guevara, who by then had met them, had begun to discuss the question of actually how was the Cuban Revolution going to be taken forward. And at that stage there was no cohesive viewpoint about what the July the 26th movement stood for, beyond a rather nebulous idea that Cuba needed democracy. Castro attempted to give it some content when he said that Cuba really needed a Jeffersonian-style revolution. That is alluding to Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States and one of the founding fathers of the United States. But there was no consistent view that Cuba was it was necessary for Cuba to embark upon a socialist revolution. There were socialists around even in the early 1950s, and of course Che Guevara himself, Tony's book makes clear, Che Guevara was later to evolve a socialistic view and so on, albeit in many ways a very limited view. But nevertheless, in that movement initially around 1955, 1956, there was a willingness to struggle, a willingness to take action, but a lack of clarity about where the movement needed to go. The trigger for the revolution itself had already been locked, if you like, but the next stage was in 1956, on the 2nd of December, again a small band, 82 people, set sail for the Cuban coast, arriving from Mexico, determined to bring about a revolution. Now they based their outlook almost exclusively upon the peasantry and upon the idea of guerrilla struggle. There were discussions about the role of the working class, but there was not an explicitly held view by any of the Cuban leadership at that stage that the working class had the primary role to play in a revolution. Now, if you actually read about the landing of this boat on the shores of Cuba, it's almost farcical. You know, the boat arrived late, the captain didn't know where he was going, and so on. Yet that was in December 1956, but in December 1959, these people had grown their forces, albeit not on the mass scale that the Bolsheviks grew in the period between April and October 1917, but nevertheless with 3,000 or so active insurgents. These people, Fidel Castro, Raul, Che Guevara and others, were on the brink of taking power, and in fact forced Batista out of power on New Year's Day, in New Year's Eve in 1959. How was this possible? How was it possible for a small band of people, without a revolutionary party in the form we would understand, to take society and overthrow this dictatorship which had the law courts, which had the police force, which had the army and all the other paraphernalia that makes up the capitalist state? And of course, I've already alluded to the factors, or some of the factors, which gave rise to this, at first sight, very strange development taking place. But for Marxists, for dialectical materialists, it is important that we understand that in a vacuum, in a society where the old way can no longer be tolerated, take the country forward, and in a situation where the Cuban Communist Party has ineffectively absented itself largely from the struggle to overthrow the Batista regime, and in a society where the middle layers in particular are feeling that they have no power, they have no prestige, they have no rights in society, added to the terrible conditions, the oppression that the peasantry face, all of these factors were present in allowing Castro to build the July 26 movement into a guerrilla struggle, which within 2 years would overthrow that particular regime. In other words, it was the objective political situation in Cuba that in effect allowed the guerrilla movement to overthrow Batista. It was not done with the conscious participation or even the awareness of the bureaucracy in the Soviet Union, for whom the July 26 movement remained for some period a rather obscure movement in an obscure island in the Caribbean. It was not done with the conscious intervention of Marxists or even the conscious intervention of the Stalinists within the Cuban Communist Party itself. Although it's true in 1958 onwards, some of the young communists began to come over to the 26th of July movement. This was nevertheless still a very nebulous political movement without a clearly defined aim beyond the overthrowing of the Batista regime. Now, Marxists, of course, would pay tribute to the heroism of those men and women who fought in the guerrilla armies to overthrow Batista. For us, it's not a question of whether these individuals were brave or whatever. It's a question of what program they were to follow and what consequences were to flow from their program in terms of what kind of society they would be able to create after 1959. Che, as late as 1960, admitted candidly that the principal actors of this revolution have no coherent standpoint. Che himself had a socialistic view and was, as we explain in his later years, edging quite close towards beginning to make a study perhaps of some of Trotsky's works, but there were many countervailing factors which made it very difficult for Che Guevara and others to come to grips with the essence of Trotskyism, not least the baleful influence of the then Fourth International, the Mandalite groups, and others, all of whom, instead of giving service to the Cuban Revolution by explaining clearly what the principal tasks were and what kind of worker state needed to be created, instead gave slavish support to the idea that the guerrilla struggle could be elevated alongside and be as much a part of the armory of Marxists as the struggle led by the working class itself. By the final months of 1958, the military were collapsing all over Cuba. And as I say, at the beginning of 59, Che and Castro and the July 26th movement stormed into the cities. Only then did the working class play a role in terms of rising up and so on. Even in the Declaration of Havana 3 years later, Fidel Castro, at that stage referring to himself as a socialist, nevertheless has a very, very cautious approach towards the role of the working class. Actually makes very explicitly plain that the peasantry is the key class because the peasantry are even more oppressed than the workers. Of course, he goes on to pay lip service to the role of the working class. He explains that the working class have a more cohesive role in society than the peasantry, but nevertheless it's quite clear in the Havana Declaration and in other writings that there was this fundamental lack of appreciation about the role of the working class as a class itself. Now, once the revolution developed, of course, initially, the question was posed, well, what do we stand for? We know what we're against. Batista's on the boat out. But what are we for? And this is where really the magnifying glass needs to be placed very clearly over the statements and the actions of these people. Clearly, the red-hot movement of revolution in 1959, 1960 meant that millions participated in the activities. Fidel's first speech in Havana drew over 1 million who were asked to endorse the idea of the war trial policy. That is, that the old bourgeois, the old gangsters who had run Cuba, be put up before revolutionary tribunals. Of course, the US went ballistic and so on, but it's quite hard to argue with a mass meeting of 1 million, although the question that Fidel posed to them of whether they thought it was a good idea or not had to be answered by a simple yes or no. But nevertheless, his words have a certain eloquence to them. He certainly knew, and were it not for his ill health, still would be probably the past master at making some of the longest speeches ever heard in the world, I suspect. But in this particular speech, turning his face to imperialism, he said, "Gentlemen of the diplomatic corps, gentlemen of the whole continent, the jury of 1 million Cubans of all ideas and all social classes has just voted." And this was a plebiscite, if you like, on the revolutionary tribunals. But